Morning all. There was a very interesting game yesterday between Dmitry Andreikin and Levon Aronian. So Aronian had been in the chasing pack for Vichy Anand for quite a bit of the tournament. Now he's playing black. Andreikin actually plays d4 and we see knight f6, and now Dmitry reels out the Trovpovski system. The Trovpovski system was used by British Grandmaster Julian Hodgson to win the British Championship actually several times. It's an amazing surprise weapon sometimes. The sort of positions it creates are very interesting and relatively uncharted. So here actually Levon played quite an unusual response. In my live book, knight e4 is the most popular, over 4,000 games. e6 about 3,000 games, d5 about 2,500, c5 about 1,500, but he played g6, which is like 624 games. It's inviting structural damage straight away, and it's a bit unusual looking because black, as though preparing a fianchetto bishop, is now interested in perhaps the bishop coming like this to b4 potentially, or using this diagonal. White actually does play bishop takes f6, quite committal in some respects, giving up the dark square bishop. Usually actually white doesn't do that. Usually white plays knight f3 apparently here. This is the most popular move, just allowing the bishop fianchetto to occur, so you get this sort of position. And this is okay, but okay for both sides. So in one respect it looks like g6 is a bit dodgy, but in another, white is giving up an important dark square bishop. And here actually takes an opportunity to play another unusual looking move. Usually e3 is played, that's quite solid. You'd expect white to try and put a solid centre up for this bishop if it did want to fianchetto, but actually white plays c4. So the most usual move was e3 and c4 was played. And this is quite interesting. White is marking out the d5 square. I remember myself playing with this structure against an IM once in the London Classic, and d5 was a big problem with these double pawns. That was a big strategic problem. So here white is accelerating pressure on d5, which is another side effect of taking that knight off on f6. Usually black just fianchettos here, or f5, that's been seen before, or d6, but actually bishop b4 check was played. So we have quite an unusual position already. Just at move 5, believe it or not, we're kind of virtually outside of live book, totally, just at move 5. So I'm going to put on a bit knight d2, and we see black playing c5, Levon playing c5, and white temporarily gives up the pawn. He doesn't want to recapture it immediately on d4 here after c takes, because this gives black a useful tempo with knight c6. No, Dmitry plays actually knight f3. So after knight c6, knight takes d4. He enjoys already a small advantage in the position. This d5 is a bit of a bind, potentially. You might think, well, can black liberate? If black plays d5, that's an interesting try, but maybe c5, and we've got a pawn majority here, which could be useful. Pardon me, as well as a grip on the dark squares. So I think this is slightly better for white, technically. In the game here, actually Levon played knight takes d4. After queen takes d4, queen a5 check. It's like black is going actually for an exchange of queens after b4, queen e5. White now just simply castles queenside, letting black take the queen. If queen takes e5, I think this is sorting out black's pawn structure and only leaving a backward pawn to play with, but still a little bit better for white, even that. But castling queenside is an interesting idea. You might think, can black actually try and exploit the king here, try and open lines or prove these pawns are weak? Well, Levon tries that with the immediate a5. And white now plays b5, leaving this pawn a bit backward on the c file as a target. d6. So it looks as though bishop e6 is on the cards. White now does exchange off queens, and now if black plays f takes, then we just take on d6, and that should be okay for white. The counterplay against c4 can be handled here, so this is okay, and there's pressure on b7 there. So black is really quite obliged to take with the d pawn. Okay, now we see the move g3, which looks logical to put pressure on the diagonal and keep an eye on d5 and other central squares. But this is a backward pawn, a vulnerable pawn. Bishop e6 is played, and black is already prepared for rook c8. So this looks a little bit on the risky side, but bishop g2 keeps things in balance, just attacking b7 in return. An interesting juncture here to explore. Levon actually has a couple of major options here, either taking on c4 or playing rook c8. Rook c8 actually initially, to me, in my initial analysis, looked quite dangerous for white. If rook c8 here, for example, bishop takes b7, rook takes c4 check, king b2, and here black seems to have a very nice position potentially after king e7 because of this idea of targeting bishop and pawn. So for example, bishop c6, rook b8, and black is already threatening rook takes c6, and you see here black's rook's coordination is very nice and kind of facilitated with the vulnerable king. And in this position, say rook c1, bishop d5, black would be standing fantastically well, in my view, because of these weak pawns, this weak pawn here on b5 in particular. So for example, rook takes is actually winning a pawn for black here, but this is a passed pawn still in this position, so maybe it's okay as well for white. But it just shows that in this position at this juncture, rook c8 does seem a viable alternative to just taking on c4 immediately. Another possibility here actually for trying to improve for white is actually putting the king on d2. So say this kind of position with rook c1, this kind of position should actually be about equal, because even if black has an extra pawn over here, they're doubled on the f file. So if white can grab this pawn, well, that's going to be okay anyway. It's going to be equal on pawns in any case. That's about equal. So okay, so rook c8 was interesting, but bishop takes c4 was played. Bishop takes b7, rook b8. Now compare this position to what we've just seen, and after bishop c6, king f8, for a moment the rooks are not connected, and also white has access to the 7th rank potentially, but b5 is vulnerable, so a4, and maybe Levon had been banking on this position after bishop b3. But a fantastic move is played here. It looks as though, oh dear, a4 is weak, and if a4 goes, then b5 will go. So there's no real time for rook d7. I don't think this will offer white much, although it's still not entirely clear, because there's always rook b1 if bishop takes b5. Black's rooks are not yet coordinated, so this is about equal technically as well. But okay, in this position after bishop b3, Dmitry Andreikin plays a great move. Well, a great practical move. I wonder if you can guess it if I give you 10 seconds starting from now. And it used to be an often controversially discussed aspect of my blitz games. That's the clue. Okay, it's a positional exchange check, king b2. It tries to underline white's play on the queen side and accelerate it. Now this is a very critical position. Should black take the pawn or just actually accept the exchange sacrifice? In this position, actually, this is possibly the mistake taking on a4. Bishop takes d1 might seem quite frightening. It's inviting stuff like this to get two passed pawns if a5 can be knocked out with the bishop controlling a8. But in reality, black might have sufficient counterplay here. My investigation revealed, for example, this sort of variation, where after rook hd8, black can lose a5 but try and get counterplay like this and come behind the a pawn potentially like this, and actually the pawns are kind of kept under lock and key virtually in this position because b5 is always going to be a bit weak. If the bishop tried to remain, by the way, on c6 here, well, the king's on c6, and actually there's no useful discovered check here. Bishop e8, king e7. So I think this would have been sufficient actually for a draw, accepting the exchange sack and trying to lock down the pawns. But Levon actually, in this very critical position, took on a4, and this is arguably the first major mistake of the game. What we see now is a very, very powerful and simple move, rook d5. The other rook can now come to a1 to try and collect a5, and will emerge with a strong passed b pawn. King e7 was played, but it's not so easy actually after king e7. Not at all. There's a little trick. Maybe Levon was banking on the routine rook a1. Sometimes it's important not to follow through with routine moves, but see the tactical resources that the opponent has. And actually rook a1 doesn't fare so well in this position as you might have anticipated. If we played rook a1 immediately, black has rook hc8, threatening rook takes c6 using that pin, and this sort of position is not that brilliant at all for white. Here black has sufficient resources and a lock on b5. It's okay. But even here, interestingly, there's king a3, which is okay potentially for white. But in the game, we actually don't see rook a1. We see after king e7, king a3 immediately, and this is a much more powerful concept. King a3 here instead of rook a1. So why with this temporary pawn sacrifice is this so much more powerful? White is temporarily a pawn down, 5 pawns against 6. Well, the bishop moves, and now rook d7 check, very powerful stuff. If king e6 here, trying to keep the rooks connected, rook c1, where does the bishop actually go? The bishop say goes to e4 to try and at least win some material or something, or no, it's pardon me, to try and deflect the bishop away from d7. Rook a7 here, and this is strong for white. This is a very strong position for white. So even though a pawn down, if for example we took here, we give white not b takes c6, no, the idea is rook takes c6 and b6 now, and this is a very, very strong passed pawn, and also the rook here across the 7th is very good. So say this position, and the white king can join in. So this is very, very nice for white. So that temporary pawn sacrifice idea shows up to being very, very powerful here with king a3. This is a very key move. Temporary pawn sacrifice. So bishop c2 was played, actually. Check. And the king actually went to f8, not e6. So f8, and it seems a bit odd to disconnect the rooks again, not coming to e6, but as that variation showed with rook c1, that's very, very tricky. Another point here though, if bishop f5, I think it looks as though this is awkward for trying to prepare e4. Rook cd1 threatens actually mate in 1, and this is strong. So bishop c2, rook d2, and black is actually losing the bishop here embarrassingly. If he goes to f5, then it's mate time. So it's a horrible thing to have to witness Levon Aronian actually disconnecting his rooks voluntarily here with king f8. And it's easy to say now the other versions of variations we've seen are much better than this. The rook's now on the 7th rank, and the rooks here are disconnected, just because this bishop and king safety was a major liability on king e6. So we see now actually in this position white has some very, very strong moves available from an engine perspective. The strongest is actually bishop d5. This wasn't actually played. So one of the points is if rook takes, then rook c1, and we've got horrible threats on the horizon. Black would actually be forced to do something quite radical here. If the bishop goes back, then black's getting mated, or nearly mated. Rook c8 check, rook takes f7, or just losing a rook actually as well. So anyway, in this position, bishop d5 is a very strong looking move. It doesn't seem from an engine point of view that there's much to offer black here. e4 though was played, and white still maintains an advantage and threatens rook c1, trying to win this bishop. So that looks like a very logical idea as well. Black played a4, giving the bishop the b3 square. So rook c1 now, and the bishop's not trapped, it has that b3 square. White has this dangerous b pawn though. We see bishop d5 now threatening rook takes f7. So bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, and still Levon Aronian's rooks are disconnected, and we've got this dangerous b pawn. So white has the upper hand. He's going to collect his pawn deficit now with interest, and he doesn't even have to take immediately. He didn't take immediately, he played rook c7. We see rook b6, and now rook c6, rook b7, and now finally restoring material with interest. So white has this dangerous passed pawn. Black's pawn over here is doubled, so it's like white is playing in a way a pawn up here. From that initial structural damage in the opening, white has this passed pawn now in this endgame scenario. Check, rook a6, rook c8. Now b6 was played. So white here has lovely options coming up with that b pawn. Rook c2, king b5, trying to get king c6 in. So if rook b2 check, this will just feed white's king. King c6, and it gets very dangerous. And then the king can also be shielded. And then white is threatening all sorts of things, like king d6 later, and trying to liberate the pawn. So in this position here, actually rook takes f2 was played, still allowing king c6, rook e7. And we have a similar scenario now. This pawn is only 2 steps away. Rook a5 provides a shield for the king on c5 potentially. Rook e6 check is played, rook d6. So the other rook can now shield on c5 if needed. So I think the check is pointless here. Either rook c5 or king d7 are both very strong moves actually in this position, with that b pawn being very dangerous. So king d7 for example, and if we go for this pawn, white can take here and just play king c6, and it's going to make progress with this pawn now. Rook c5 to shield against rook c2. There's rook c5. So very, very dangerous position now for Levon Aronian. So rook e6, rook d6, rook e7 was played. And in this position, actually, it seems one move actually stands out as being really, really powerful here. Very interesting rook and pawn. And you think it should be getting quite easy, but if we played rook a-c5, then actually black can offer a bit of stubbornness with rook b2. So both rooks are coordinated to stop b7 here, and black is on the verge of breaking out with his own passed pawn protected by the rook there. So no, this position actually requires a very, very accurate move here. Can you guess what it is? If I gave you 10 seconds, or you might want to pause the video. Okay, rook d to d5 threatens now b7, and being able to play rook b5 to shield against that b file. The check was played here. So if we just demonstrate rook b2 now, rook a b5, rook e6, king c7, white is making progress here. Rook c2, rook dc5. Here, b7, and it's getting critical. The pawn is winning a rook now. Black would have to give up the rook. So in the game, we see after rook d5, check, and the king ventures to c7, check, and the king goes to c8 now. Any check here can be answered with a rook coming to c5. So check here doesn't really help. White would want to play here rook ac5, and if rook b2, rook b5, getting behind the pawn is important. Now this one, so there's no rook b2, and now b7, that would be crashing through with the pawn. So okay, in this position after king c8, rook e8 check was played instead. King d7, gaining a tempo now on the rook. King f8. If in this position rook b8, then the king can be used to evict that rook with tempo, and now b7 after check, king c8, and the pawn is winning material. So it's apparent this is starting to get a bit hopeless. King f8 was played, b7, and now white is threatening rook a8. Using the pin on the king is very helpful here. Now Levon played rook e7 check here. If he plays rook b2 in this position, then rook a b5, and this doesn't help black. The check here and the check here, rook bc5, and rook d8 check is queening. So actually the king's position on f8 is actually important in some of these variations now. Levon played check on e7, king c6, check, king c7, check, and now king b6 was played. At move 44, and Levon Aronian actually resigned here. Let's see if the check on b2 is played, what would happen? Well, white needs to block that now, otherwise he's going to lose b7. So rook a b5. Now, if say rook a2, then we queen now. There's nothing stopping the pawn actually. If takes here, takes, rook here, we're going to queen the pawn, for example, like that. So, very interesting game. It seems there were a couple of very critical positions. The first one was the decision, I believe, to in this position, rook c8 I think would be more comfortable for black to play and try and coordinate the rooks. But later, when the exchange sack was offered, I think if black wanted to draw, he could actually have enough play here, although it looks very, very dangerous to lose a5 eventually. Black technically is okay with taking on d1. What we saw in going for the extra pawn instead temporarily was white actually increasing the positional advantage, and this bishop a kind of tactical liability around here. And in fact, white missed, it seems, the most incisive engine move, bishop d5, which combines king safety with potentially trying to trap the bishop, and also things like rook c1. So this would have been apparently a crushing move. Just at move 24 here, this looks to be a crushing advantage, nearly, very nearly. A very interesting game with the Trovpovski, a good advert for the Trovpovski, and it shows that maybe people have forgotten their preparation against it. I mean, it seems an unusual response system that Levon played here. Maybe he was aiming it as a surprise weapon against the Trovpovski, but yeah, it seemed to give white a reasonably good game. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.